This is Algebra 2, Unit 11, Lesson 5, more work with sine and cosine functions. Now, sine and cosine aren't as intuitive as the algebra that we've done before because it's working on a circular functions. So we want to get some more familiarity with the sine and cosine function working from there. So remember, from the definition of sine and cosine, if theta is an angle drawn in standard position whose terminal ray passes the point x, y on the unit circle, then sine of theta is the y-coordinate, cosine theta is the x-coordinate. Okay, so if we know that from our unit circle, given the function f of x equals 6 sine x, which is the value of f of 60, well, f of 60 will be 6 times the sine of 60. Okay, so what is the sine of 60? Well, the sine of 60 is the square root of 3 over 2, because if I go to my unit circle diagram, which is right here, here is 60 degrees, it's going to be the y-coordinate, square root of 3 over 2. Alright, so all I have to do is multiply these together. 2 cancels the 6, leaving a 3, so this is going to be 3 times the square root of 3. So that's number 2. Okay, let's take a look at exercise 3. If g of alpha equals 4 cosine alpha minus 2 sine alpha, then g of 330 equals. Okay, so I need to know what g of 330 is. So I'm going to plug that in. G of 330, I'm going to plug it in everywhere for alpha. So 4 times the cosine of alpha, which is going to be 330, minus 2 times the sine of 330. Okay, so 4 times the cosine of 330, I need to go to my unit circle diagram, cosine of 330. Here's 330 down here. Okay, cosine is the x-coordinate, so that's also going to be the square root of 3 over 2. So 4 times the square root of 3 over 2 minus 2 sine of 330, and sine on my unit circle diagram at 330 degrees will be negative 1/2. So 2 times negative 1/2. Okay, so if I multiply these together, 2 cancels the 4, leaving a 2, 2 times the square root of 3, and then negative 2 times negative 1/2 is positive 1, so it's 2 times the square root of 3 plus 1. Okay, so it's helpful if you know your unit circle. If you're not sure, you can always work, if you just memorize the first quadrant, it can make your life a lot easier. Alright, now remember, if you're thinking the first quadrant, for 30, 60, 90, the values are sine of 30 is 1/2, cosine of 30 is square root of 3 over 2, and then they reverse each other. Sine of 60 is square root of 3 over 2, and cosine of 60 is 1/2. So if we think about that, 330 degrees is in the fourth quadrant down here. So that means my reference angle right here is 30 degrees. So we said sine of 30 would be 1/2, if you know that. And if it's in the fourth quadrant, A, S, T, C, remember the values here, cosine is positive, but sine would be negative. So this would be negative 1/2. And so since 30 for sine is negative 1/2, that means square root of 3 over 2 will be cosine. But in the fourth quadrant, it's going to be positive, so square root of 3 over 2, that's why it's there. So if you can memorize the first quadrant and then think about where you are, then that can help you do that if you don't have your unit circle diagram. Okay, so let's move on to exercise 4. Which of the following is not equal to 1? Alright, let's think about where these coordinates are. If you are at 0 degrees, you're right on the x-axis, what coordinate would you be at on the unit circle? Well, you'd be at 1, 0. So, cosine is going to be the x-coordinate, so that's going to equal 1. Alright, cosine of 360, you'd still be at 1, 0. It's one complete revolution, so that's also going to equal 1. Alright, sine of 90 degrees. If you're at 90 degrees, you're up here. What coordinate are you at there? You are at 0, 1, okay? But sine is the y-coordinate, so that's also going to be 1. All right, so that leaves sine of 270 is going to be my answer, but let's see why. 270 would be down here. Its coordinate would be 0, -1. So actually the sine is the y-coordinate, so that's going to be -1. Okay. All right, let's look at exercise 5. For an angle alpha whose terminal ray lies in the third quadrant, it is known that cosine of alpha equals -0.96. What is the value of sine alpha? Okay, now 0.96 isn't one of our values that are on the unit circle. But remember that we have the Pythagorean identity that goes with sine and cosine. It says cosine theta, or alpha squared, plus sine alpha squared will equal 1. Leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared. Remember, the unit circle is going to be 1. All right, well, we know that cosine alpha is -0.96 squared plus sine alpha squared equals 1. All right, so let's solve this for sine alpha. Okay, so we need to know what -0.96 squared is, so I'm going to have my calculator. All right, -0.96 squared is, oops, I forgot to put in parentheses, -0.96 squared, forgot to square my negative, is going to be 0.9216 plus sine theta squared is equal to 1. All right, so if I'm solving for, or sine alpha, I'm sorry, solving for sine alpha, I want to get it by itself, so I have to subtract this. So sine alpha squared is equal to 1 minus 0.9216. 1 minus this, which is 0.0784. Sine alpha squared equals 0.0784. And then to solve it, we have to take the square root of both sides. All right, so I take that answer and I take its square root. Go there and grab it. Enter. I get 0.28. So sine of alpha will be 0.28. Okay, however, I am in the third quadrant. Okay, now remember when you take the square root, this is actually plus or minus alpha. So it's going to be plus or minus 0.28. Okay, now I am in the third quadrant. Remember A, S, T, C? In the third quadrant, tangent is positive, so that means sine and cosine are negative. So it would have to be the negative 0.28 for there, so for number 1. All right, now let's take a look at the reference angles and the angle of any angle and its reference angle, and the trig values that go with them. So let's take a look at an angle and its reference have been given. Okay, so if I have the angle 110, its reference angle is going to be 70 degrees. All right, so if you're at 110, which would be over here, 110 would be here, the reference angle, remember, is going to be from the x-axis, is going to be 70 degrees. All right, now let's see. In degree mode, determine the sine and cosine of both the angle and its reference. So we want to know the sine of 110 and the sine of 70, and the cosine of 110 and the cosine of 70. Okay, so let's take a look. All right, so sine of 110, I'm in degree mode, is that, and the sine of 70 is also that. So these are going to be the same. It's going to be this one's going to be approximately 0.94. Okay, all right. Now, if I look at the cosine of 110, I get that, and the cosine of 70. Okay, 110 is negative, 70 is positive. All right, so this one is going to be negative 0.34, and this one's going to be positive 0.34. Okay, so these were both positive. These were positive and negative. All right, so let's try sine of 235 and sine of 55, and then cosine of 235 and cosine cosine of 55. All right, so let's take a look at those. Sine 235 is negative 0.82, and then the cosine of 55, oops, that's the wrong one, sine of 55, sorry, is positive. So for this one is going to be negative 0.82, and this one is going to be positive 0.82. All right, and then cosine 235, cosine 55. All right, 55 I've got there. Cosine of 235 is negative 0.57. One is positive, one is negative. Okay, so this one is negative 0.57, and this one was positive 0.57. Okay, all right, so we have a pattern happening here. So let's try one more. Sine of 282 and the sine of 78, and the cosine of 282 and the cosine of 78. All right, let's see if we can predict what's going to happen here. Sine 282, and then the sine of 78. All right, negative positive again. So this is going to be negative 0.98, and this is positive 0.98. All right, let's try cosine. Cosine of 282 is 0.21 approximately, and the cosine of 78 is also 0.21, so approximately 0.21. All right, so clearly the absolute value of the sine and cosine are the same for an angle and its reference. This fact can be exploited to produce sine and cosine values for angles if they are known for their references. Okay, so basically, why are these different? Okay, again, it's going to depend on what quadrant that this angle falls in. All right, if you are in the 110 here, you are in the second quadrant. So 110 would be here. The reference angle of 70 would be there. Okay, so remember your quadrants, A, S, T, C. What is positive in the second quadrant? Sine is positive. That means that cosine will be negative in the second quadrant. So if you're at 110, it's going to be negative 0.34. All right, what quadrant are we in here? 235, 180, 235 would be in the third quadrant. Here's 235. What's your reference angle? Your reference angle right here would be 55. All right, now notice if you are at 235 for both of these, the reference angle is the same, but in the third quadrant, this is going to be negative. So they're both going to be negative because tangent is positive in the third quadrant. So sine and cosine will be negative. All right, same thing over here. A, S, T, C, 282. All right, so this would be 180, 270, 280 would be over here, 282 would be down here like this. So your reference angle right here is going to be 78. All right, so that's your reference angle. That gives you the value right here. Cosine is positive. All right, cosine is positive in the fourth quadrant. So that means it'll be positive 0.21, but it'll be negative 0.98 for the sine because the reference angle is 0.98 there. Okay. All right, now let's see if we can figure these problems out. Given that cosine of 30 is the square root of 3 over 2, and sine of 30 is equal to a half, determine the following values in exact form. All right, so we're going to use our reference angle right here. We know the cosine of 150. All right, so 150 would be an angle measured from here. So that's 150. The reference angle would be right here. This is going to be 30. Okay, so cosine of 30 is the square root of 3 over 2. Okay, we are in the second quadrant. So if this is going to be the same value as this, but it's in the second quadrant, is it going to be positive or is it going to be negative? Well, if you remember A, S, T, C, sine is positive in the second quadrant. So that means cosine will be negative. So if the reference angle is square root of 3 over 2, this is going to be negative square root of 3 over 2. All right, so guess what sine is going to be? Well, sine is positive, and the sine of 30 is 1/2. It's going to be 1/2.